so artificial intelligence, and we're working with circuit modeling, which is a form of artificial intelligence. I think has a very it has a tremendous amount of promise in terms of mining some of these pre-done model runs. And once you get these algorithms set up and tuned, they're very fast. They take sub-seconds to run. And now all of a sudden, you have the potential to create a system where someone closer to the decision maker, whether it's the decision maker or not, or a person in the middle, can do scenarios, can do statistical runs, can do a variety of things that leverage this existing information in ways that I think can be very effective going forward. The other thing that forecasting in particular is trying to deal with events as they're occurring imposes on modeling is a tremendous time constraint that other types of applications don't impose. Thus, the surrogate modeling or the AI is a good way to handle that, but certainly adaptive gridding and those technologies have a lot of promise as well, particularly if you're trying to do this at a national scale. So imagine wanting to have something down to a resolution of food lines at a national scale, yet modeling the entire East and Gulf coasts. That's a tremendous HPC problem in real time. And so there's opportunity. I'm trying to look into ways in which you can grid the entire coast, but only activate the parts of the grid that are relevant to a given storm track, for example, if you're dealing with tropical storms, to try to optimize this problem again in creative ways. That's a physical problem, a numerical problem, and a computing problem all at the same time, and again, a challenge that we're working on. So those are my comments, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of questions that people are aware of, and I'm aware that we do not have emergency managers on this panel, so I'll quickly try and get some audience participation, I hope, that can add to that. And the first question is a little bit more about emergency managers and what actionable weather information do emergency managers need? And again, we may look to the audience. I don't want to be too presumptuous about that. And can we improve on that? And related to that, if we are unable to answer that question, how, and this is where I'm looking towards the whole panel, but maybe more Rebecca, how do we engage with decision makers effectively to affect the status quo, if you like? So that's kind of a complicated thing. What do emergency managers get now? What do they need? And how can we address their need is kind of a general theme here, if anyone wants to take that question. And then before moving on to other questions, I'll reach out to the audience as well. So anyone want to take that kind of general question if they understand it?
Well, so as far as what emergency managers need, we do a lot of work where we work with emergency managers and do interviews and surveys and other kinds of work. And so there's research in that area, and then there's a lot of work in practice which will provide information to emergency managers. I think a lot of that varies by the situation and by the kind of resources in the emergency management group. So what happens in New York City is very different than what happens in rural Georgia, say. But emergency managers have kind of their goals of saving lives and protecting their communities, and they need whatever they can get. So I was talking with someone who works at FEMA recently, and she said if you ask people if they need information or they want it, they'll say yes because they always want more. But you have to get behind that and figure out what kinds of decisions they're making at different times, or what kinds of decisions they would like to make but they can't, and then what information would interface with that. And there's approaches for doing that. That can really benefit the meteorological community in terms of providing that information. And sometimes the answers just mean changing something a tiny bit. You might know that they need storm surge information, but they might say, oh, to make these decisions, actually to be able to evacuate people, let's say 2 days in advance, we need to be able to do these things 5-6 days in advance. And so they need some information then about what the likelihood is so they can start moving down that path. I think your other question was about how can we interface better with them, and I think the biggest way we can do that is to ask questions and to really listen to the answers. So to listen to the answers of what people are saying they want or what they do, what they can use from their frame, and not put our own frame about what we think they should do on that, and then to walk in with as few assumptions as possible. So anytime you walk into a conversation with someone and you assume that they must want this thing, you can't really hear what they're trying to say. And so I think that sounds really simple, but I think it's actually very hard to do in practice because, as was talked about in the panel this morning, in academia or research, we're trained to look at something really deeply, and it's very hard, and you're usually talking to people that look at that same thing very deeply. And so it's difficult sometimes to come out of that frame to be able to hear what someone who spends their entire life looking at something else deeply, the way they view the problem, and to bring those two together, but it's really critically important.
Right.
So actually last week at Stony Brook, we had a workshop with the Weather Service and emergency managers and other stakeholders as part of a collaborative science and technology research grant with NOAA. And it was interesting to see that interaction. And this was actually with the Alan Alda Center. So they have a center where they try to improve communication, science, and that interaction between stakeholders and scientists and so forth. And they ran through a bunch of interesting exercises where you're just basically trying to getting to know the other person and effectively developing trust and being able to anticipate each other's thoughts in some sense. So there was some aspect of that, but when it got down to the meat of it with the discussion, it was, I mean, basically what the emergency managers, in terms of the briefings, and the forecasters had to distill a briefing from 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds, and 15 seconds to get to the point. I mean, basically the emergency managers really wanted to, right at the beginning, know what the hazards are for that particular day. I mean, and at least for New York City, because there's a lot of moving parts, they really need to know what the worst case scenario is. Even though it may have a very low probability attached to it, they can work with that and at least iterate to try and figure out, you know, what the best situation to do. But if you leave out the worst case because it's like a 5% chance, it can cause problems, and we may have seen some events recently like that. You also want some measure of confidence in that, and that confidence doesn't have to necessarily be a number on a screen, but just the way you're projecting yourself when you're having that conversation. They need to feel like that yeah, it's a two-way interaction, and your verbiage that you use is very important about, you know, whether it will happen or there's a chance of something happening and so forth. So at least in the short term, that's what we focused on for this meeting. There was these three elements to that. On the longer time scales, it's a whole other range of issues.
I'd like to just echo Brian and Rebecca's comments. One of the things that we found in working with emergency managers, some of which were government and some of which were private. You know, so in the private case, it was with electric utilities. And part of the communication was an identification of sort of the business use cases, their decision-making use cases, where they felt that this was the biggest gap in the information that they had. And so one of the things that in these efforts that we had the opportunity to do was to try to develop something much more customized to try to fill that, excuse me, to fill that gap. So in the example that I'm showing with the slides, in Rio de Janeiro, was trying to get some estimate about flood risk. You know, for work that we've done with electric utilities, it was trying to understand the likelihood of storm-driven outages, the uncertainty associated with that, and then resources necessary for storm restoration. The key behind anything that we implemented was the communication, taking the time, sitting down to really understand how they use information, how it needs to be presented, and then working backwards to sort of create models that they could use. But like Rick had said, these models were implemented in a static way, and then they would only be updated over a longer period of time. There was very little opportunity for sort of direct feedback into how the model would be executed, or a set of models executed.
I think my experiences are similar. Oftentimes, and it really depends on where and what the organization is that's interested in the results. Some actually have enough in-house technical capabilities that they're comfortable looking at visualizations that come from the computer, and with a bit of conversation about confidence, about uncertainty, then they're willing to sort of take that information and run with it themselves. At the other end of the spectrum, oftentimes, the first question that I will get is, what do you think is going to happen? Right now, what's the most likely thing to happen? And then we'll talk about that, and then the next question after that is, as kind of Brian said, what's the worst case scenario? Or what's maybe the most likely, if that doesn't happen, what's the next most likely thing to happen? One of those two questions typically comes up next each time. And models are great for helping to provide insight in those areas, but again, they tend to take interpretation and confidence, and there's no question that communicating confidence isn't about just making a picture that somehow has confidence bars on it. The communication of it, the actual expression of it, is a critical part of that. And I think we see this frequently on the evening news or the evening weather forecast, right? The weather forecaster puts up a forecast, and then oftentimes, depending on how the person presents it, you get a sense of confidence. You get a sense of, this is locked in, it's you can pretty much count on it, or, it could be sunny or it could be rainy, So we're used to digesting that sort of messaging through, oftentimes in how we consume weather information. What hasn't happened, the problem is that there really isn't a designated part of the professional society that we interact with broadly that disseminates water-related hazard information the way that they disseminate weather-related hazard information. And so one area which we could certainly improve within the higher education is to help train people not only to be able to understand weather-related information, but if we can train them to also, there's enough similarities there that it makes a lot of sense to broaden their education and help train them to understand how to deal with water-related information, and then start to serve that role more significantly. I mean, it's happening, but I think there's a lot of room for expansion in that area.
So I'd say that one of the things emergency managers need is to get the response they're looking for from the population. And to do that, we give all the information we can and the levels of uncertainty, and I think that's critical. But we also rely on being able to translate that beyond the emergency managers and to the broadcasters and the wider media community. And there's been some recent work, and Rebecca's been among the folks who've done these incredible jobs developing visualization tools that I think really get buy-in. And I'll say that this year I went to a conference that was joint between emergency managers and broadcasters, specifically trying to nut out how do we communicate to the emergency managers and then work that next step to the broadcast community, and that includes blogs and so on, to get that actionable information acted upon.
Okay, I think I'm hearing two things. One is communication, generally, pre-events as well as visualization in terms of communication. And the other thing I'm hearing is tailoring, tailoring to the needs of the people making decisions. And all of that is a lot of work. Before I go to the audience, I will go on to the next question. I do want this to be discussed a little bit, and that is more on the technology side. And it was alluded to a couple of times already. What modelling strategies need to be developed to address the needs that have come up already just amongst ourselves in terms of, in particular, tailoring to the needs of the emergency manager? And I apologise, I will allow other people to chime in on this after we've gone through this. In terms of, there's modelling to think about, there's also maybe extra observations or being clever with observations. I'll include that into this discussion. So what about the technology side? And let me throw AI in there as well, for good measure. So this is all technology. What are the things that what are the opportunities that exist for us to help with, in particular, the tailoring, as well as the communication? Tough one.
Well, we've talked about uncertainty. I think that's critical to get to these outcomes, the forecast, the material to give to the emergency managers. We take complex, disparate observations, we run them through a weather forecast model, and that weather forecast model probably feeds a hydrology model or a storm surge model, and then that goes into another process. So at each of those levels, we have to pin down the uncertainty, and we have to understand where that can be pinned down and where it can't be. And doing it purely in a process way, we've hit roadblocks for decades, I would say. And so I mentioned artificial intelligence, AI, before, and Chris just mentioned it. And it's not a panacea, but it provides another toolbox, another way to get at what we're trying to do. It requires an enormous amount of data, and it requires data that's essentially labeled. So you know that if you had this situation, this was the outcome, so you can train this system. But if we can use that even as a mode of reducing the uncertainty or highlighting things that really can't be pinned down well enough, then I think we're at least along the path of improving the guidance we can give.
And I'll just add, again, in the coastal zone, I think more and more we realize that we have fairly mature now storm surge models. We have weather forecasts of the precipitation. What we really don't have as well resolved and sorted out in a technological sense are the models of surface water hydrology in low-slope coastal zones and the way in which those interact with the coastal storm surge themselves. It's a difficult problem. It's one that just has again shown up on the national news and with Harvey and with Florence and with some other recent storms, but it's definitely an area of research and technological challenge at this point.
The only other thing I'll add on the tailoring is some of the complexity, because it will, even if the business use case is the same, as you go from one application, this was already said, the differences between, a small city, a rural area versus a major metropolitan area, how emergency managers would interact means that the tailoring that would work in one area may not be very applicable to others. And so one of the challenges is how can we develop methods that are more scalable, more easily applicable to a diversity of even the same types of use cases. Because ultimately, how the information is used and disseminated and available data will be highly variable. So that's definitely a barrier. I don't see AI as being a panacea for that, not at all. But some of the learning that could come from those activities, if they could be, better categorized, then that could be potential future role for AI. Certainly not today.
Yeah, just to throw in a few things. The model challenges, there are many challenges on all scales. The one thing, at least from the weather prediction side of things, I think we all see this when we look at the hurricane forecast. Unfortunately, we're still at the stage where the models we're using, which include many models from different countries and different things, we still have this problem where we call it under-dispersed. It basically means that 4 or 5 days out, we have a situation where the reality may not fall within that cone. And that's why you see that cone often changing as the storm is approaching. And so we have a fundamental problem where our models, which involves data assimilation, getting observations in, but also we're realizing, we've known for many years that the model physics are not perfect. So there's opportunities with AI, I think, to also improve the models and think about better usage of the observations for data assimilation, because if we can better do that, we can hopefully get reality at least to fall within that cone of uncertainty a few days out, which would be helpful. And to do that, here's the scary thing, because not only do you need that technology or AI, but you need a data set, you need sample cases. Rick was mentioning past events as being useful. I think as a community, we've been very negligent with the fact that we don't have a good library of past events that we can draw from, or for that matter, reproducing events in the future that may happen. There are groups, Carrie Manuel, Ling Lin at Princeton, running scenarios of tracks of hurricanes out to 2100, but the question is, okay, what impacts will that have, and can we plug that into our models and so forth? So there's a lot of opportunities, but yeah, it's a big data problem, and that is, we have to figure that out too.
So just to add to the complexity, a couple different things. One is on the challenges of modeling. Going back to my PhD dissertation, which was on observations for improving weather prediction, I realized, and a few people on this panel have talked about how you really have to view the different components of a prediction system as working together. So the observations, the data assimilation, the models, the different components of models, different types of models. You can't just attack one piece of it. You have to really understand how they're interacting with each other, especially in terms of error propagation and reduction and so on. I think what we've come to think about is really that this prediction system, which in and of itself has a lot of complexity in it, is really just part of this dynamic, evolving, interconnected forecasting, information, communication, decision-making systems. There's a much even larger system, and this is important because a lot of the work in risk communication has been done with things like health or climate change or things like that, where the information doesn't evolve that quickly relative to the decision. So you might have a lot of time to make a decision, and there's not necessarily time pressure at the end, or if there is, it's pretty loose. But in these weather prediction problems, the communication of the information, the evolution of the information, and the hazard itself, and the impacts are all evolving on the same time scale. So you can't really separate one out from the other because they're all moving at the same time. I think another thing I wanted to mention with respect to the tailoring, in the community that I work in, where we talk a lot about how do you provide better forecast information for decision making, there has been a lot of work in tailoring, and then the question is how do you make that more generalizable? So how do you not go down the path of providing a specific tailored forecast to everyone, because that requires too much effort really, and then what you usually end up doing is giving the information to the people that can pay for it. And what you really, those are often the people people that need it the most often are the people who aren't in those kinds of situations. So to really make sure that we're providing the information needed to the full diversity of population, diversity of uses. So how do we take this approach of providing more tailored information and make it more generalizable? And I think we're starting to get down the path of doing that. Something related to that is we work with colleagues who are in information and computer science, and the way they think about information technology is very different than the way I was trained, as a meteorologist. And they really recognize the ingenuity of the population and the fact that there are, 20,000, a million, I don't know how many teenagers now who are going to invent something we've never heard of that's going to revolutionize what we do potentially in the next 4 years. And so to really, when you think about the challenges of providing information, to recognize that we don't control the situation, and often we're not going to come up with the best ideas, and how to develop capabilities so that we're open to the fact that someone that we think doesn't have expertise in meteorology or AI or whatever can manage to actually solve the problem for us sometimes in specific times and places, and sometimes more broadly, and to so have the system kind of be open with the democratization of technology and knowledge and so on, to take advantage of those capabilities and ingenuity of people out there.
All right, so I'm going to come up here because I can't see you. So I'd like to open up to the general audience. Anything we've discussed so far, any comments you have, ask the panel. I do have one other theme, just I see just the lights. And that's something that we should be, something else that we can add to this discussion now hopefully would be what can the academic community do specifically? If there are any concrete or specific ideas that we can do moving forward and taking forward out of this conference?
Hi, my name is Samantha Friedman. I'm a sociology professor here, and I work in the area of demography. So I'm very interested, because I'm kind of an outsider in your study. I'm just curious about the integration of housing data and population data. Specifically, I study residential segregation, so I'm very aware that there are inequalities in where people are living. and in terms of where they live relates a lot to environmental impact, because a lot of poor minority people live in areas that are affected by flooding. Hurricane Katrina is case in point. So I'm just wondering, in the long term, I know you're talking about very short-term critical modeling, but in the long term, are you connecting the weather-related data, the flooding data in particular, with the socio-demographic and housing data to kind of pinpoint in the long term, are these areas constantly being affected, so that way city government can be more informed about, you know, where they can implement changes in housing. So that's kind of my question. It's a longer term modeling question. How do we integrate other sources of data in making decisions that can help in the shorter term?
It's a great question. Anyone want to speak to that?
I mean, I'll say that people are doing that kind of work, but it's in its infancy. So people are talking about it a lot more than they're doing it, and I think it's the challenges that people talked about on this morning's panel is just getting the right kinds of people to talk to each other and to do those kinds of things. So I think it is being done, but there's definitely a lot more that can be done, and often it happens, in my experience, through people from different disciplines getting together and talking about the kind of data sets they have. So if you're trained in discipline, you would have no idea what kind of housing data is out there, what kind of data, you know, other kinds of data. And often that there are people who do sort of, you know, GIS or kind of geospatial information integration that broker those kinds of conversations in my experience. But I think it's a hugely important area.
So an event hits a particular situation, a particular location, and the outcome is whatever it is, and then there's rebuilding. So one approach to thinking about that is to, if an event happens in a region that feels similar enough to your location, that's the time to have a conversation and essentially do strategic planning at the community level. So that you say, okay, it happened there, if that happened here, how do we rebuild to be better and different? And so thinking about the future of the community infrastructure and building when it isn't right upon you, so you can get buy-in and get the discussion going, I think is another approach.
Let me give two sort of connected but different answers, and just point out the fact that you went to the wrong panel this morning. I have a colleague who, you know, there's a lot of people here, but if you happen to bump into this very tall guy in a very dark suit and a shock of white hair, his name's Phil Burke, who's a planner, who thinks about exactly these issues, and he's speaking on another panel right now in the same time slot, actually in the Performing Arts Center. So anyways, you got close. You got close. Anyway, but that being said, two parts to the answer. One is that we have not done a very good job of creating data sets or really information that clearly communicates flood hazards throughout the country. The information that's available by and large is what's put out through the FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program. But that has a very limited design. And for example, it's intended to be present day actuarial. What's your risk of being flooded today? And they purposely don't think about things like climate change. They purposely don't include issues like climate change and how things are changing tomorrow through whether it's climate change or future development or all of those things. So unfortunately, we really haven't, particularly at a national scale, created the information that is needed to do planning effectively. And then the second part of the answer is the planning process in and of itself is still trying to figure out how to do its job a little bit better. And Phil Burke's work in particular is working with communities that are faced with the need to plan for multiple different things. So they'll have an economic zoning plan, they'll have a recreational facilities plan, they may have a flood mitigation plan, they may have a bunch of different plans, but oftentimes what you see are one plan will encourage and place development in an area that another plan says is a bad idea. And so Phil's work in particular is to how to create planning tools that help integrate plan integration efforts, so that in cases where you have reasonable information on water hazards, for example, they're used in an integrated way and end up with planning done effectively, which has oftentimes not been the case thus far. There's a little booth downstairs for our Coastal Resilience Center, and there's even a one-page flyer on his planning integration work that I encourage you to pick up. And like I said, if you happen to start walking up to tall, white-haired guys and say, are you Phil? And eventually, if you do that effectively enough, it's a statistical problem. I mean, eventually you'll find it.
Maggie Melendez, I'm a meteorologist in the public sector I'm here at PAC. I hear it's kind of an old holy grail problem in the operational weather community, which is the communication of probabilistic information and uncertainty. So a number of the panelists I heard have actually experienced talking to the emergency managers and other users. So I'd be interested in hearing what can you tell us about what is being done right? How can we tell that this is that uncertainty is being communicated adequately? And what is not being done well yet that is not being paid sufficient attention by the operators, providers of meteorological information that needs to be happening? I mean, is it all a question of just getting better reliability from the models, or are we having a language barrier, so to speak, right? Where are the areas that need to be stressed?
And looking like that, what can academia do to help that? I'll let that be your question. Anyone else?
So, I mean, where I've had some experience along these lines is with very focused commercial applications. So this is with electric utilities. So the emergency managers there, in fact, they didn't want to hear about uncertainty. A lot of them come from an engineering background because they're building, let's say, or maintain an electric distribution system. So it required a lot of interaction to explain, you know, the weather's driving it, the uncertainties in the weather, and then even if you were doing something more focused, like an impact prediction like outages, we also had to explain, which they eventually accepted, that, oh, the data that we're using to drive, let's say, machine learned outage prediction model, there's uncertainty there. So eventually they grasped the idea of uncertainty, and then they, you know, became part of the conversation in terms of how to design and provide that information. But it was very labor intensive. Lots of conversations explaining, and as Rebecca had outlined, a number of different sources of uncertainty that have to